I would like to take time now to introduce our next speaker who is joining us virtually today is Dr. John Munsell. So John Munsell is a professor and forest management extension specialist in Virginia Tech's Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation. He is the director of the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition and has served as president of the Association of Temperate Agroforestry during the years 2015 to 2017. He co authored the Community Food Forest Handbook and is the lead author of the Urban and Community Agroforestry Systems chapter. In 2017, John chaired the 15th annual North American Agroforestry Conference in Blacksburg and has represented North America during the concluding roadmap plenary sessions at the Fourth World Congress on Agroforestry in Montpellier, France in 2018. He also leads advanced silviculture training for federal agency foresters from across the country. So John is bringing with him a wealth of experiences and viewpoints today, and he's going to share a little bit more about the marketing angle of different non-timber forest products. So let's welcome John.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah. Hello from Blacksburg, Virginia. Sorry that I couldn't make it out this year. It was great to make it out last year and meet folks in the region and participate in the workshop. I think in the same room, actually. It looks very familiar. Um, And then to see some of you at the Great Plains Growers Conference in St. Joe's, which was, I think it was in the middle of a polar vortex. That's right. It was really, really cold. I actually was delayed a day getting out. Um, but yeah, I'm sorry I can't be there. I just lots of things kind of on the plate presently. But I'm happy that I can join virtually. So thank you for having me. Thanks to Raylan for the introduction and Sugata for including me in this. It's really exciting what's happening in the region, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share screen now. So just maybe I also need another thumbs up that this is visible. Yes. Okay. I don't hear anybody saying no. Um, so right, I'm with you today to speak to forest farming markets. And there are people in the room that know more than I do, actually, but we've been working together on many of these issues. So I'll do my best to cover markets. But the interesting thing is it's about the future of just and equitable trade. And we have here in Appalachia, east to you, we have focused on some of these issues around the evolution and growth of forest farming and how to achieve something just and equitable regarding market transactions associated with the products that are coming off of forest farms. But at the same, let's see, oh, there we go. Okay, so here's my joke after lunch, right? It's an unenviable position to be in. The future, little crystal ball. Um, there's more work to be done. There's some things that are known, and there's the unknowns and those types of things. So I don't claim to have a kind of strong crystal ball for you, but I can point to trends and things that have happened in our work in the region in the last decade plus that I think indicate need, but also ways to address those needs and how to proceed to ensure that we have that just and equitable market associated with the work that's occurring underneath the canopy to produce materials that are in demand. But I do like to start with this story, and for some of those that have maybe been in presentations I've given before, you've heard this one, but I think it struck me and it's influenced me over the years in terms of my work in the field. I was new faculty at Virginia Tech in 2007, and we have an agricultural research extension center in Rafine, Virginia. It's kind of a satellite campus, and a lot of beef research done there, but there's 200 plus acres of Appalachian hardwoods on that 900-acre farm. And the director of the center was interested in more of kind of a whole farm or whole property approach to management, not just focusing on grazing and livestock and in the pasture space, but also what can we do with the 200 acres of woodlands that we have here, kind of the proverbial back 40, as some folks refer to it in the forestry community about, yeah, you've got pasture, but then you've got some woodlands. And so I was pulled into this research extension center around that, kind of coming from the forestry background, and then being an extension specialist here at Virginia Tech. What can you bring to the table? How can we engage with folks around that whole property, not just stop at the wood line? And so there was a field tour that they host. They host a field tour every year. I think it's annually, and a lot of livestock producers were participating, and then they were going to all the different sites for their research tours and that type of thing. And they positioned me next to a woodlot, and along come all the livestock producers for that stop during their field tour. They come up, and the first question I asked was, how many of you have a woodlot on the property that you own or manage? And over 90% of the hands went up. And then I followed up and asked the question, how many of you consider yourself to be an active manager or engaged with that woodlot in terms of production? And there were less than 10 hands that remained. So it goes. We have this kind of compartmentalized focus, but our woodlands offer a bounty of resource above and beyond just timber products. There are things that food, medicine that we've depended upon for generations that come out of our woodlot. However, what's happened since that time, and this is like '08, and we can go back 10 years and see that the USDA estimated that agroforestry was only practiced on about 1% of US farms. And then we kind of hit the fast forward button, and we jump to today, and we can see that that they're now estimating it's occurring on 7% of US farms. So more hands are going up kind of in this little story that I'm telling. And some folks in the room and others have been part of that. I've seen that kind of swell of interest. But when it comes to forest farming, which is absolutely a part of agroforestry, so when the USDA says that now we're looking at 7% application on farmlands, forest farming is a part of that. So that's what's happening underneath the canopy. So that's that question that I ask, what is occurring there? It could be timber management, but in an agroforestry sense, it's co-management. So you're managing the canopy, you're also managing what's happening underneath the canopy. And so the critical question as that growth occurs, but what we're running into in terms of forest farming is something related to the markets associated with that intentional production. And maybe you've had some introduction to the kind of 4 I's in agroforestry. Intentionality is a big part of it. It's not just having plants in the woodlands and harvesting them. You can have them, but it's about stewardship. Or you can plant them, and then it's about stewardship. And in our neck of the woods, and yours as well, I think ginseng, in terms of a botanical, shade obligate, grows underneath the canopy. That's its preferred habitat. Is kind of an iconic species, and oftentimes the anchor for conversation. And so to some extent, people think, or my conversations have been around singular focus on ginseng. It's certainly a very valuable species, and it has an interesting supply chain. But research in our region, and Janine Davis has been part of this, demonstrates that there are scores and scores of species that are harvested out of our woodlands that are not associated with timber. They're non-timber forest products. There are multiple botanicals, there's mushrooms, there are barks, there are leaves, there are, a broad range of species that have long been harvested out of our woodlands. These are our non-timber forest products. So ginseng certainly is part of the conversation, and rightly so, but there are many other species, some of which are harvested 2 and 3 times the rate of American ginseng from woodlots. So there is unlike what you might think around elderberry, for instance, and if we're talking about open field agroforestry applications, if you're planting elderberry in a buffer or you're planting it upslope, maybe integrating it with livestock or whatever the case may be in that open space, most of the elderberry comes from Europe. We don't have strong, long-standing markets around elderberry here in terms of producers. Um, there's some great examples of cooperatives in the Midwest actually around elderberry trying to kind of grow that, but it's dominated by other parts of the world. However, um, the species here, when it comes to our non-timber crops, uh, 50% of what's sourced into the species wise into the global market are native here and have long been harvested here. So there are long-standing existing markets around these species. So it's not that we're, in terms of forest farming, trying to invent market space. The market space exists. Now, there are challenges associated with that, and I'll cover some of those. Um, but I just wanted to kind of share that the markets are here for these products, but we have some work to do in terms of transitioning in a way that will support the intentional cultivation and the risk that a producer takes on to ensure the price point is right to make that happen. So we do have forest farming market evolution that's occurring, but there is work yet to be done. But we can take a step back because I think we need to consider history, and we can go deeper beyond kind of the colonial period and think about the eastern portion of the United States. And I know you're west of the Mississippi, but there are woodlands there that have long sourced food and medicine and production materials to our native communities. Same here in Appalachia. So we need to respect and recognize that those forests have provided for generations to people and communities and well-being and materials that we depend upon. We can kind of move into, say, the 19th century, and Dr. Davis does a much better job of kind of characterizing some of the history associated with the use of non-timber forest products and the markets that exist. But I like to point this out because the eclectics coming out of Cincinnati, Ohio, actually in the 19th century, formulated kind of the first systematic approach to utilizing natural medicinal products for dosing, for directing certain types of materials for certain types of ailments, and really created this systematic framework that fed into what we know today in terms of our pharmaceutical markets and our consumption therein. They built it out. And a lot of that was on the back of kind of the Civil War time frame of trying to be a little bit more specific, providing medical providers with information about which constituents to use at what rates and how to kind of maintain a healthy delivery of that material to people to address health issues. And then we can look into the early 20th century where there were extension bulletins and other types of materials promoting forest farming, intentional cultivation of some of the species that are part of what maybe the eclectics built out in terms of these natural products and the medicine that they can provide. And so there was a bit of a pulse in the early part of the 20th century where there was recognition around intentional cultivation because there was concern about the impacts related to the plant populations or the fungal populations. And it was, and barks, I mean, in trees and all these things. And so there was some attention paid therein, but then that kind of subsided. And then we had a renaissance in the 60s around natural products and what we could gather out of woodlands and those types of things and connections to plants. And that led to kind of a growing consciousness around what's coming out of our woodlands and how to kind of work with those materials and those plants and mushrooms and such to benefit the human community, but also benefit the environment. And then we can fast forward to the attention paid to studying the markets and working on trying to convey information that would help individuals grow and have those kind of productive relationships And, Janine was instrumental in that, has been a long-standing architect around promoting that information and promoting growth. And it has essentially the Bible in many ways in terms of growing some of the botanicals, but also the kind of increase in interest and formalization around agroforestry and thinking about that kind of intentional process and the co-management and blending of species in the same space and managing that functional ecosystem so that you have multiple streams of production, multiple outputs. And forest farming is where we tuck in the kind of agronomic proposition underneath the canopy. We're managing the canopy. We're thinking about the health of that forest overall, but we're also growing species that are shade obligate and depend upon that condition and have markets. And speaking of markets, touched on those already, but just in terms of growth, this is kind of like following the Renaissance and moving into the 90s, the early aughts and that type of thing. The herbal products industry, as an example, has grown for 20 years straight. So the demand for these nutraceutical products has continued to increase. The companies are experiencing that. They're trying to figure out over time how they can sustain the materials they need to meet that demand. And it's 7 billion plus market globally in 2017, a little bit dated. Even more dated would be some research or some publication from the Nutrition Business Journal in 2011. The consumer sales of herbs and botanicals in the U.S. reached $5.28 billion at that time, and the raw materials were valued at $500 million. So we've seen a lot of growth in the last 2-3 decades in terms of demand for these products, and NTFPs are right there in that supply stream. But it's sourced for decades almost entirely through wild harvesting. Forest farming concept is there. There are forest farmers, but as this market continues to grow, greater demand, there's been a lot of wild harvesting. Now that's focused primarily in the woodland side. There are some field cultivation, maybe at greater rates when it comes to the species that are sun-loving and need that type of habitat. And I don't want to cast stones at wild crafting or wild harvesting. It dates back generations, and it's been an important source of supply for materials that we increasingly depend upon or demand for. But what wild crafting misses in a way is kind of the traceability. And there are kind of small scale, local initiatives around foraging, and those are fantastic, getting people in the woods and bringing those products out. But when it comes to thinking about scale and growing demand, there is a bit of a mystery when it comes to the plant or the mushroom in the woodlands, and then how it makes its way through the value chain to a retail product on the shelf. There's not a lot of formality around that. So as these companies in the industry and other folks that demand these products for their retail, there's some gap there in terms of being able to go back and understand, one, the impacts to the populations that they depend upon, two, how the value is distributed across that supply chain. And so when we think about just and equitable trade, there's some complications around that, and we're working to address that. And another critical point is, the conservation. So when you don't have traceability and the ability to kind of confirm the impacts to the raw material and the species, and you don't have an ability then to schedule out and understand how you can manage demand in terms of management in an agroforestry sense of those species, there's question marks around conservation. We can go back to why those bulletins came out in the early 20th century. It was around concern, and there are international treaties that have been signed at CITES associated with ginseng That one is regulated. So there's periods of time that harvest can occur. There are state-based systems that's kind of managed by the Fish and Wildlife System or Service that, tracks that species because they saw massive depletion over the course of 150 years, 200 years of demand. Golden seal is listed, but many of the others that I had in that table earlier are not. There is no tracking, so we don't necessarily know the status of black cohosh, and so uh, there are organizations like United Plant Savers that are out there kind of focusing in on conservation aspects, and that's really kind of a critical underpinning when it comes to forest farming. It's conservation through cultivation. So we know the markets are growing. There is some mystery around how the raw material makes its way to a retail product. But by virtue of intentionally growing, there's a more kind of systematic way to track that and ensure that we're reducing pressure on some of the wild populations and meeting some of that demand for industry in a way that's agronomic. We've here in Virginia, we've been very fortunate to have legislators at the federal level that support what we do and have written letters to the Forest Service and others requesting and requiring inventory so that we have a better sense of the status of some of these plant populations. We have not really made a great deal of progress there, but the senators are there and pushing and recognizing the importance of trying to understand this as this market continues to grow. So speaking of markets, there's obviously the dollar sign. So we can focus on conservation and traceability and all those types of things and say, hey, it's growing. But at the end of the day, a farmer needs to understand what's the margin? What type of profit can I make from this? Because there's risk going in with these slower growing shade obligate species. They're perennial. So to get them to market, it takes a couple of years or years. So we're not looking at something that's annual. So the dollar signs are important. And research out of Virginia Tech can show that and this is one of the challenges we face in terms of the longstanding supply coming from wild harvesting is that it's stuck in time in terms of some of the price points. And you can see, for instance, massive amounts of dry pounds of black cohosh coming out. I'm not going to go into the amount of plants that it takes to get 264,000 pounds annually out of woodlands in the eastern side of the United States. But you can see the mean price point at $3.62. So, there's been economic analysis around this at $3.62, kind of a status quo price point. A farmer who puts resources on the table, outlays and plants in, and then has to protect that for 6-7 years to bring it to market at 362, it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a lot of risk there, and you're going to go in the hole. There are some like false unicorn that have high price points, but the demand is a little bit lower. So you really need to be kind of specialized in terms of finding outlets for supply. Golden seal, decent price point, but still doesn't make muster when it comes to growing that intentionally over time. So back to just an equitable trade and this kind of existing market, there is some work to be done in terms of evolving and working to elevate those price points. And this is research conducted by Eric Burkhart and Mike Jacobson out of Penn State. And they just did some present net value work around planting, and they looked at a host of iconic species. But basically, I want to underline that ginseng is the only one presently that at the price points we see, it kind of makes muster in terms of being able to realize a profit margin. But it's harvested at lower rates. And I'll show you a slide earlier. The cultivated doesn't quite cut the mustard because at the end of the day, folks are interested in kind of the wild, gnarly rhizome that has those features that are really where the value lays, not necessarily the medicine. And all the others at current price points don't get there. This goes back a little bit in time, and I'll show you some evidence of how we're changing some of that in the marketplace. But here, this is also, I got to credit Eric with this one. You can see the wild price over time, leading up to 2014, continuing to elevate. This is ginseng, but the cultivated, which is purchased, stays static and fairly low. So again, ginseng's a little bit of a kind of a different beast, but it's one that captures attention. However, it's also provides some examples in terms of the challenges of kind of moving into that space. If we're going to stay with the same prices for raw material that's on the back of wild harvesting, where individuals have no risk, risk going in the woodlands and harvesting, but at the end of the day, they haven't planted that, they haven't tended that necessarily. They're just pulling it out and looking to sell. So we also at Virginia Tech wanted to understand where the markets are happening. I think again, trying to move in this direction of the future market. And we needed to know where things were moving. And so there was some work done to understand where, for instance, black cohosh is highly traded. And you can see heat map here, and you see southern West Virginia, Southwest Virginia, portion of central Kentucky in darker colors, indicating that there's a larger amount of trade around black cohosh there. Now, still maybe average $3.60 a dry pound, which is challenging for forest farmers. But you can see the distribution throughout the region. So there's trade in black cohosh from northern Appalachia down to southern Appalachia. But let's look at golden seal, because didn't see a lot of black cohosh traded in the Midwest, but you can see golden seal traded at some decent rates in the Ohio River Valley, moving out to Missouri. But at $22 a pound, that's still a bit of a question mark around cultivation. So golden seal does have a little bit of a higher rate of cultivation, but at the end of the day, most is still wild harvested. And we can see false unicorn as an example, Western North Carolina, Northern Alabama, and some parts of West Virginia, Kentucky being a source of production. So we want to understand how those things are distributed in terms of the transactions, because as a forest farmer, it's nice to know that. But if we can't get the price points up, then there's a challenge of entering the market. Another thing to consider is also economic distress. And this has something to do with markets and evolution and growth. And Appalachian Sustainable Development was able to make a really good case for a proposal and receive some funding, because we just look at where black cohosh is traded, and we can see those dark red counties in the Appalachian Regional Commission distressed counties framework. You can see a lot of the forest dependent, economically distressed communities are trading in this space around black cohosh. But at $3.60 a pound, well, there's some work to do, and work has been done. Another thing to note too is that a lot of trade happens with more local demand. However, the amounts are small. The larger volumes are traded with what we might call large traders or aggregators, and they're moving material to the West Coast, Northeast, or to Europe. And those price points have been stuck in time. Now, some of the smaller apothecaries and other brick and mortar businesses or consumers in some areas are paying higher prices because they're more interested in local economy. But when you move into the space of aggregators and large buyers, they're looking for that kind of rock bottom price. It's been status quo. Also, access is another critical issue when it comes to thinking about the future of markets. More and more of public land is being restricted in terms of access for harvesting. Permits have just died off for a lot of federal forest lands in Virginia. It's illegal to harvest any plant material on state forest lands. So, that's been constrained a little bit. And those are the commons that have long been a kind of point of source for the wild harvesters. That's continuing to drop. So that's an opportunity as the market grows for forest farmers to fill that. And so we did some survey research out of Virginia Tech in Southwest Virginia, understand who might be willing to farm or who might be willing to lease their land. And we had some pretty positive responses that as far as we could extrapolate, would be thousands of acres of land potentially available, like a hunting club might have access to an absentee owner's forest land. There are opportunities for forest farmers who may want to expand operations beyond what they have in terms of woodlot, or maybe they have no woodlot, can find space to produce. But ultimately, the current situation is, and I've kind of iterated on this a little bit, is that we have a changing NTFP market. It's focusing on the traceability, and these companies need to understand down the road, or even your local consumers down the road, are they going to be able to get high quality product in a predictable sense? And then, what type of trade are we talking about in terms of the exchange? And is that just and equitable? And now we're seeing never before seen federal and private investments in producer support. We're really at a tipping point when it comes to agroforestry in general, and forest farming in many cases is part of that thrust. And looking at engaging technical service providers so that folks can receive the information and assistance on the back of their taxpayer dollars to help in terms of move in the direction to establish or expand farms. And then nursery production, getting planting stock in hand. So, and forest farming provides an opportunity to add value in that regard. And so, because you have chain of custody, you can go back to a farmer, they can show you what they're doing, where it's happening. There's an ability to assess those stands and understand when harvesting might be appropriate, and that helps with scheduling out in the future for consumers so that they have some confidence around that. And they also know that they're not necessarily in a mysterious sense impacting negatively some of the wild populations that they've long depended upon, but kind of transitioning into this cultivated model. So we do, here's some proof. I could talk about the concepts and the needs and the evolution, but you can see it's been last 6-7 years, companies have invested in forest farm material. They have paid higher price points. The American Herbal Products Association, in their trade newsletter, has recognized a new domestic sustainable supply of forest cultivated medicinal herbs. We have greater recognition on the part of the culinary industry related to forest foods. So mushrooms are finding more and more space locally produced in terms of the plate that you might order at a restaurant. And we have had investments in terms of certification systems that allow for producers to, hold up their activities and find space in the value added arena. And assistance on the part of nonprofit service organizations and universities and even the federal and state agencies to try and move in that direction. And there's been media, some examples from our region, the Appalachian Voice, and just kind of extolling and celebrating forest farmers who are out there intentionally stewarding and achieving that conservation through cultivation, but bringing product to market. And it's been up and down. It's not easy to break into this space, I can tell you. Lots of lessons learned and things, but it hasn't necessarily gone backwards, which is great. Incrementally speaking, there has been growth. Like I said, not always milk and honey, but that has continued to grow in the region. And you've probably seen this definition. It really is on the back of the intentional cultivation and being able to demonstrate that. And in the agroforestry sense, it really brings people into their woodlot, and they start to think about managing the green infrastructure. It's not built infrastructure that provides the right type of habitat, but it's living trees. It's the soil. It's a dynamic ecosystem. And then that really provides some benefits in terms of the co-management side of things, which fits right into the agroforestry model perfectly. So we have a coalition that's been in existence here with the USDA funding, and there's some great work happening in the Midwest, and Northeast also has a coalition. And a bevy of partners working on these issues that maybe 10, 12 years ago, we're kind of siloed a little bit, but we've been able to come together on this umbrella and tackle some of these critical issues in terms of the future of the market for forest farming. Lots of resources we've developed, and we house those on our website. So we have a bit of a compendium, videos, extension publications, a newsletter. Some of us are working in the peer-reviewed space on the science side and technology to help with citing. So a lot of work done over the last 10, 12 years. Very proud to have been part of it. We host multi-day workshops, and extensive participation, always sold out. And that's led to is not just like, hey, going home and saying, all right, I learned something cool, but we have survey work that shows folks have put stock in the ground. We're building a base of production in the region. And that it's really important and exciting, but it also needs to be matched with growth in the market side and the infrastructure there to support that when it comes to market. So we've been happy to see that there's been some investment on the nursery side in terms of planting stock, some of which in this funding that came out is specific to woodland species, and also just working with really cool people that are investing in native in terms of their enterprise. Both like a nursery person like Jonathan McCrae, he's growing native tree species, but he's also growing native plants that can be planted into woodlands in a forest farming system, or Terry Black in Kentucky, who grows and sells to market, but also sells some of his material to other new and beginning forest farmers so that they can get started. It's kind of working on that issue. And North Carolina State has been instrumental, along with Warren Wilson College, in trying to get some work done in Western North Carolina in that regard. Like I mentioned earlier, we've had legislator support. Here's our former governor, Governor Northam, learning about forest farming and non-timber forest products at our Catawba Sustainability Center, which is a property that Virginia Tech owns. And also Senator Mark Warner and Senator Tim Kaine being very supportive of proposals going in and writing letters of support and continuing to push the agroforestry conversation. We've also been able to generate funding opportunities for forest farmers from both the USDA, but also private families. This is a funding program which now is in its second cycle, which is including Missouri and Great Plains states, and it's going all the way. Save Alaska, that's the only state that there's not an opportunity to submit a proposal to establish a forest farm. And so we've been doing that, but some of the strongest work on the kind of marketing, processing, aggregation, and distribution side has been by Appalachian Sustainable Development. And that's where they have really been able to turn the corner on price points and show that there are companies, there are entities out there that want to buy that value-added material because of what it means in terms of conservation and scheduling and confidence and predictability and product quality. And just to show you here on the right side, you can see this is in dry price per kilogram related to the research I showed earlier. And then you can see what Forest Farm Botanicals are getting through the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub, which ASD manages. And, we've got dry pounds versus dried kilos. But I can tell you that you're seeing a dramatic jump in price point to where that table I showed you earlier, published by Eric Burkhart, those negative signs would become positive signs. And so, again, it's been up and down, and it's not always easy, but moving in the direction of trying to get those price points up. And that's drawn the recognition on the part of the industry because they want to have that social responsibility investment in their product. They're natural products that are sold on the shelf, and they need to have the backing behind that. Let's see what I'm doing on time. I'll probably kind of blow through this. This is just a small little example to show you how you could elevate the profit margin or I guess value retained in the region on the back of small increases of price points for forest farm material. You can take 1 million paid to producers on, with respect to a certain product and turn it into 2.1 million just with 20% forest farm and a very conservative price point jump. Now, this will be my last point, generally speaking. One thing that we learned as we developed this coalition was that forest farming in many ways is characterized as like you own woodlands. Okay, so you're planting there, you're growing out. That's kind of the conventional model. And we still work and support that, of course. But you can see the traditional way that the supply chain was structured, where you have a collector, they sell to a country dealer. Maybe they're able to skirt that and go to a bulk distributor or regional consolidator. And I take this from Eric Burkhart's slide again, just to recognize. But what was coming out in terms of how people were perceiving forest farming was that, oh no, the forest farmer is just going to take over all of that. So you'd have historic wild harvesters and primary buyers and stuff that were just cut out of the marketplace. So what we decided to do, and on the back of a chapter published in University of Missouri's agroforestry manual, which says forest farming is not predicated on just owning land, it's actually the practice. We developed a point of harvest program to work with wild collectors and primary buyers so that they could also be part of a systematic and traceable system of production that the industry and demand the consumers will recognize is also being forest farming, because forest farming again is not just owning land, it's actually what happens. And so that program we've developed with ASD, we've moved that out. We've done multiple trainings with wild harvesters and primary buyers who want to have that professional development for their collectors. And they can situate right alongside a forest farmer who has a woodlot on property they own and get into the space where there's value added price points. And I just did a compliance visit to East Tennessee with one of our groups, and I focused in on a Solomon seal trade. First of all, the primary buyer said, I've never seen this much volume of Solomon seal sold in bulk. And he had two collectors. Those collectors realized 7.5 times the price point for that Solomon seal raw material because they are participants in the point of harvest training program. So they have the traceability, all the paperwork was there. They were able to match, I was able to match everything, look at volumes and prices, and go right back to the harvest. And those collectors are being trained on sustainable forest farming practices. Lastly, American Forest Farming Association announced this at the conference in Roanoke in March. A few of you that were there. We are developing an association that will help support, not supplant, local regional initiatives around forest farming so that we can address some of those policy issues, some of those larger issues in terms of awareness and consumerism and all those types of things to support the work that's being done in terms of technical transfer, growth of forest farming in certain regions. And I'll leave you with this: how farming and forests could sustain the planet. This is a BBC article. Maybe that's a little sensationalized, but they make the case in there that as population grows, and we're looking at 11.2 billion people by 2100, we need to think about how to sustain and intentionally manage what we've extracted out of our woodlands for generations in ways to ensure that we can meet the needs of ever-growing population. So that does it for me right at 1:45 your time, 2:45 mine. So thanks for your time and attention. I'll stop sharing my screen and take any questions if we have time.
Hey, John, it's Badger. Quick question. There's been some discussion of this earlier today. When it comes to herbs, ginseng is famous for, the harder a life it looks like it's had, the higher price it will fetch. But what other herbs, if any, is that true of? Karen was talking earlier about importing sort of loose forest soil to make beds for, rhizome division for people who want to get started planting. But do you think that those would be good production beds for forest farmers selling to these, certified forest grown programs that you're discussing? Or would you rather have a tortured looking black cohosh if you're going to pay twice as much for it?
Um, I didn't, I couldn't quite catch the first part of your question because the microphone was not, but I think what you're getting at is there's the morphology, like, the shape of the root, the gnarliness of the root, and there's like energetics, and there's other kind of Eastern medicine philosophies that relate to that. So it really is for ginseng, it's largely driven by its form. However, and then there's been some pharmacognosy work around, its medicinal properties, but we have much greater research and I think evidence associated with species like black cohosh and golden seal in terms of their medicinal properties and values, where you're not going to get that. Look, there's black cohosh rhizomes that have interesting features, but it's really about the volume there. Same with golden seal, because they want the chemical constituents and they want to be able to extract that and utilize it and process. Um, so again, ginseng kind of rearing its head as an interesting, unique product, one that is captured attention. But at the end of the day, I think it's about some volumetric production. But what is that volumetric production coming out of? Is it no intentionality? Is it limited or to no information about the next generation, the next stand? And so that's where the forest farming model can come in. Now, there are some that have kind of thread the needle when it comes to wild simulated ginseng, where they can get that kind of property in terms of the root structure or form. But I think with a lot of the others, it's just about the volume. And I may be missing a few in that regard. But I think, look, we've done some raised bed golden seal production, and they look great. They grow fast. They're huge. Maybe the aerial parts are too big. Maybe they need to be in a little bit more of a kind of uncomfortable situation. But I think with golden seal, for instance, you're not really interested in the root form. It's just the mass. Same with cohosh and others. I'm not sure if that's answered your question because I didn't get the first half, but
Thank you.
When you mentioned the point of harvest program and collectors, getting this greater price point, what does that point of harvest program look like in terms of hours, time commitment to get and see that improvement? How much time did they invest in that?
yeah, it's a great question. It's an annual program. So you have to stay consistent in it, meaning that there's annual trainings that are offered, and individuals. I'll back up a little bit and say our first experience was that we wanted to try and engage with collectors, and we went to libraries and we, put flyers out and tried to publish in the local newspapers, and nobody was showing up. So we ultimately landed in a spot where we were working with primary buyers who had the foresight and interest to invest in continuing education for their base of supply, their kind of workforce, if you will. And that they were questioning why this hasn't ever happened, and then seeing an opportunity for it to happen. And so we've created a system where we have primary buyers, and then their team of collectors are pulled as part of a kind of unit training for a day-long program where rudimentary things are discussed, like safety, policy, and these things that just are good to know, you need to know as a professional. And those that are showing up are those that want to be there at the table. They haven't had a lot of services when it comes to agencies or institutions or any other partners in terms of their professional development. And then we go into things like preparing raw material so that it's more efficient. It's more efficient for you. It's more efficient for the buyer. Species identification to avoid adulteration, rhizome division, things they can do in the field, and also then sourcing planting stock to those collectors so that when they go out and they're documenting their practices, that's part of the program, they're also planting back. So they're extracting and then they're planting back. So it has that kind of cyclical sustained yield component to it. And then on the back of that, there are bulk order purchases on the part of companies that want to invest in that material. And those things have happened for 2 years in a row now with these elevated price points. So we still have a lot of work to do. We're just starting to scratch the surface, but I can tell you the reception has been very positive on the part of the different units that we work with. The unit being like a primary buyer who has a series of collectors in the region, and they're all coming to the table for the training and participating in the program and staying formal and keeping their books up in terms of being able to have a compliance assessment that matches. So it's an annual thing. For instance, we were in East Tennessee with that group I mentioned in the fall. We're doing another one this fall. And the same people that were participating in the fall ask questions of the primary buyer. Are we doing this again? Yes, we're doing it again. That's how you stay current in the program.
I have a question, and thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I was curious about, as you were talking about driving at the price point, is the demand for any of these kind of lesser popular herbs like Solomon seal, is that at all keeping the price low? And as you look into the future, do you see that demand increasing, and how that would affect, the price of these herbs over time?
Yeah, so that's a good question in terms of kind of the specialty trade, because a lot of these are specialty products, smaller scale. In terms of that demand affecting the price point, I tend to think more along the lines of kind of a status quo or business as usual model in that regard. Look, and I'm not on the front, lines of trying to retail products to consumers to make sure that, like, if I pay more for Solomon seal, that I have a profit margin as an apothecary or kind of mid-scale, herbal products company or something like that. I think and this might be a little bit of a rabbit hole, but there's some challenges around how much companies spend or businesses spend in terms of labeling and kind of messaging. Spend a lot of money in that regard. I've seen some people in the industry just say, we just pull the plug on some of that or scale back, and let's pull some of that profit back into investing in the source of production. It's a long-standing issue. I mean, you can look at commodity farmers and they're kind of also too squeezed in a way. Then it starts to add a lot of value down the supply chain around how to make sure you're competitive in the retail space. But yeah, and so that's the front end of your question there with respect to like Solomon seal. I think that one thing we did recently, and we've had really great response, is we've surveyed, and this has been the last 3 or 4 months, we've surveyed forest farmers in Appalachia. We have like 350 responses right now, and we were looking at some of our mature meaning like 5 years or more of production. And they are selling a lot locally, right? So, and that kind of aligns with the research we found. And it's those local connections where I think you can realize some of those profit margins a little easier, because it's kind of that confined economy that has a little bit more of a deeper sense of commitment to the area. However, we're not void of larger companies paying attention and trying to figure out ways, and they have done some of this, trying to figure out ways to increase the investment back. So the specialty order of Solomon seal is not just business as usual, but it also has value. And then there's a corporate social responsibility model. It's complex. I don't have enough time to kind of go into the intricacies about how procurement in the natural products industry meshes with or doesn't mesh with the accounting side. But at any rate, like I said, we're not there yet. The crystal ball is not fully clear, but we have made some of these steps. And I think that as long as those signals continue to move in the right direction, that we could realize some of this. And we would take over the whole thing? Probably not. It's just going to be growth in the specialty side to support production. And the second part of your question was, I've forgotten as a. So
I think you mostly answered it, but it was as demand increases for some of these herbs, how would that kind of naturally increase the price point of these, or in a
Well,
nutshell?
I don't think we're looking at like commodity growth anytime soon necessarily. So there might be some safe space in that regard where we wouldn't run up against a demand relative to, price point and flooding the market and that kind of thing. So, it's a specialty practice and it's not going to be for everybody. But I do think there's a lot more space yet in the market because it is a specialty market in of itself where some of that space could be found, and we might not run up against some of that flooding issue in terms of prices falling through the floor. But down the road, long-term future, maybe.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us all today, John. It was a very informative presentation.
Thanks, Raylan, and have a good rest of your workshop, folks. Sorry I couldn't be with you maybe next year.
Thank you.